Good afternoon, British and American culture class. This is the first daytime class that we have done. I just did another one. I'm fortunate to have a little bit of breathing space today for the first time in 2.5 months from my children. If you hear a dog barking, there's nothing I can do about that, but for now he's sleeping, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, this is part 2 of the lecture on America, the first lecture on America. We're on week 7. In the textbook, it's called The Hard Fork. And the reason I chose that title is because the hard fork refers to a fork in a road where you go one way and you separate from the other way. You have two choices, the high road and the low road, or the American culture or the British culture. Recently there has been a lot of interest in cryptocurrency, and so this hard fork means completely separate, because you can have forks that kind of separate a little bit and maybe down the road they actually come back together again. But a hard fork means you split completely in a dramatic fashion, and this road goes completely in another country, and this one goes in another one. So not just a fork, a regular fork, but a hard fork where things separate completely. And there's two distinct choices. So the thing I want to explain today, I did say that I was going to talk about Columbus and Native people and everything, but I've switched the order, so that will be part 3. And there's a reason for that. It's just because all these things are kind of related to what we already talked about. The English Civil War sets the tone for a lot of the things that I said in part 1. And this sort of continues, it's not chronological, but this is not a history course. We're not going from day 1 to day, 1 million. We're just talking about things in terms of their cultural significance. So we are going to have to, next part, rewind and talk about Columbus and talk about the, huge clash of cultures from people from different continents that haven't met each other and are completely unfamiliar with everything, the genetics, the types of plants, the animals, the lifestyle, the appearance, the clothing. The cultures are completely alien to each other, and we'll talk about that next week. So I think it's better just for us to get right through into what happens in the Revolution. Given that we've been talking about British culture for so long, and that we're kind of just sort of showing the connection between American culture and British culture right now. Now, I've had a few questions. One of the questions was about, the concept of freedom in the America, because I told you it's a little bit complicated how it works. I did mention something that Professor Buckles said, which was, the freedom to be unfree. That's Professor Gosel, rather. Professor Gosel said that Americans want freedom to do whatever they want. And that may include having a more restrictive society. So when you think of freedom, you feel like I can do whatever I want. But American society, at least the Puritan version of it, is that they wanted to make a different type of society, but the society in Europe didn't allow them to do that. So they moved it to America, where they could force everyone to do the same thing that they did, which I wouldn't consider that freedom. I would consider that a restrictive sort of, I don't know. It's like quarantine. But there's people, obviously the Puritans had that idea and they tried to keep everything on lockdown, but very quickly, we'll talk about this today, there's 13 colonies when America tries to become independent. And they're all different. The reason there are 13 and not 1 is because, New England is composed of Massachusetts and primarily, and Connecticut and other things later. But Massachusetts has a certain way of doing things, and that whenever some group of people doesn't like it, they just kind of wander away to another part, since the country's so big, and unfortunately because the native people don't count, or that they're not a threat as much because they've gotten sick and there's less of them. We'll talk about that in part 3, but basically there's a lot of land available. So you have the Virginia Company in the Chesapeake and the Tidewater area, and you have Maryland, which is kind of a Catholic sort of institution. Virginia is kind of modeled after, you know, English society and its class structure. Massachusetts is Puritan, where they just want to, you know, worship and have a hard-working society that doesn't enjoy anything. And they have their own emphasis on certain things. And then Rhode Island is created because people don't get along with that particular way of doing something. And then you get, you know, you get Delaware and you get New York. And New York actually was Dutch before, as I said. So before I run out of breath, it's very complicated. I told you the New England version when I said freedom, just because that is the story that is told. It's not because it has become the dominant narrative, but the way that it connects to our present day to answer the student's question is that people think often they color the whole United States that way. There's other really important cultures, but if you're going to pick any single most influential culture in the history of the United States, the number one choice is New England. It's New York. New York's not exactly New England, but it's New York and New England. It's the Northeast that has the most power. That's where Washington, D.C. is. That's where all, and I mean, there's different types of, there's variations of it, but the core idea of what freedom means to Americans starts there. And then there's variations of it everywhere. California, but it's that contradiction and variety and diversity that make United States the United States. So you'll see, I can't completely answer your question now, students who ask good questions, but if you pay attention to the class for the rest of the term, for the next 7 weeks, you will see what I mean. You will see how freedom in its various forms, no matter what exact version or definition it is so important to Americans that they will take their guns, go down to the center of the city and break quarantine, even those coronavirus around. They will not listen and say, you have no right to close the economy. You have no right to keep us in our houses. We will protect ourselves and we will go outside if we want to. And they take a gun with them. That's American freedom. Not everybody does that. Not everybody agrees with it, but that's a component. It's a strong component of American culture, and nobody can deny that. It's not happening in any other country where people grab guns and say, try and make me stay at home. So there's protests all over America. Look in the news and you'll see what I mean. Now, this is similar. Like my students ask, what's so similar about America, 250 years ago? That's the thing. Americans don't like something. I mean, they're liable to demonstrate and often demonstrate forcefully with weapons if necessary, even if not necessary. But often these peaceful gatherings, there's no candlelight and 1 million people in Seoul protesting the government. If people are going to show up and they really mean business in America, they're going to grab some weapons and they're going to go and demonstrate how serious they are. And that's a part of American culture that can't be ignored. Where does all this start? Well, here we have the Hard Fork title and the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is a really important event that is not talked about very much, so you might not be familiar with it. I know it well because one of the results of the 7 Years' War is that New France is defeated at Quebec City. When the British and the French fight each other, the French army loses in a very interesting strategic battle between a French general and a British general. I won't get into too many of the details, but that essentially ends the French interest in Canada, which has already had at that point, a good 150-year history, and that results in the province of Quebec, which is part of Canada now. So I'm very familiar with that part of the story. But essentially, there was a 7 Years' War. It started in 1756 and it ended in 1763. it was a fight between the two most powerful countries in the world at the time. If you don't count China. I mean, there are powerful countries, but in terms of global reach, the two most powerful empires in the world are the French and the English. And they go at it, and they fight in North America, they fight in India, they fight in Africa, they fight in Europe, they fight on the ocean, and they fight on the land. It's really world war. It's a world war. It's not called World War One, but it's a candidate for the first real global war, because these two nations battle. You might say they battle to the death, in a sense, because the direct result of this for the British Empire is the loss of America. The direct result of this war, and there's no denying the connection, for the French is the French Revolution. So basically these two states, the two most powerful states, they fight each other to the very limit, and both states are on the almost collapsing by the end of it. When they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763, they're both kind of saying, we can't fight anymore. We're out of money. We're out of public support. We're out of equipment and soldiers and food and everything. And like, both states can't fight anymore. However, the British get the better of the French in a lot of the battles and the situations. So the French they have to give up. The main thing is they have to give up their colonies in North America. They get to keep the Caribbean territories, but they have to give up Quebec. They have to give up New France. So that's the result of that. We won't get into the French Revolution because that's an entire other course. But what happens is, because of the 70 Years' War, because of how difficult, how hard the struggle was, and how much sacrifice both states had to make, both the governments are basically at their limit. They have no money. So there's a variety of things that the British try to do. One of the things they realize is that they haven't had good, tight control of the colonies at all, ever. So for about 80 years since they were founded, these colonies have basically been able to run themselves, partially because, as I told you, the English government has a chronic problem with money. So the king was busy with stuff in Europe, and he didn't have money to send soldiers and to enforce the rules in America. So you get stuff like Pennsylvania is founded by a guy named William Penn. And basically the king just owes his father a lot of money, and instead of paying him back all the money he has to pay him, his debt, which he doesn't have, he just says, okay, you can have this land in America, and you got to call it Pennsylvania because I borrowed a lot of money from your dad. And so William Penn goes over there, and he is the governor. He has a royal charter, so he has absolute power pretty much in this area called Pennsylvania. It's a very famous part of the United States. It still exists today, and that started out as the king giving away land because he didn't have enough money. These kind of situations happen all over the place, and there ends up being 13 territories, colonies, which largely are left alone. But after they fight to protect those colonies from the French, and the Great Britain and England pay all the money for that, they expect, Massachusetts and New York and South Carolina, North Carolina, and all the other places, Maryland and Virginia, they expect them to start paying for the cost of all of the stuff that they spent and all the effort they made. But the Americans don't like that. Nobody likes taxes going up suddenly. So there's a Sugar Act, and there's a Stamp Act, and there's a Tea Act. And all these things are basically, you got to pay a certain amount of money, 2% on your tea or 3%, and 2 or 3% on your sugar. And every time you make a document, a legal document, or you order a newspaper, or you buy a newspaper, or you order something, or you whatever, any piece of paper needs to be stamped, and you got to pay a little bit of money. And every time you buy some sugar, you got to pay that. Every time you export sugar, you got to pay a little bit of money. And they put a monopoly on all the tea coming from Asia, and you got to pay money for the tea as well. And you can't really sneak tea in there or get tea from American, brokers, because there's this huge tea company called the East India Tea Company that gets given a monopoly over all the tea by the British, and they start bringing in tons of tea at a lower price. The Americans don't like this. They freak out, and the result is lots of protests. Basically, they burn down people's houses. The Boston Tea Party is the most famous one, but even before that, when the Stamp Act starts up, they have these commissioners everywhere, and they hate it so much that what they do is basically a bunch of, you would call them probably terrorists now. These bunch of American guys will just go to the commissioner's house and then threaten to kill him. And then when he runs away, they'll break all of his stuff, burn down the house, and steal everything. So all the people who are supposed to collect the Stamp Act money, they leave. I would leave too. So they're doing these, Americans sound like the British people were treating them horribly. That's the story you always hear. But it's more like they were just kind of quickly changing the environment, and the Americans reacted to be like, you have no right to do that. So one day Sam Adams and all these other Sons of Liberty, I'm doing this description really fast. This is the 10-minute version of history or whatever. But basically all the Americans get on these boats that have come in to deliver tea, and they take all the tea and they throw it in the water, and they didn't call it the Boston Tea Party until like 30 years later, and then they named it the Boston Tea Party because it wasn't a party. Again, it was illegal, and it was sort of an act of terrorism, but the rebels considered that necessary in order to protect their rights. So the Boston Tea Party was that moment where they actually started directly interfering with what the British were trying to do. And when they damaged all that property, basically the British shut down Boston and threatened everyone and said, pay back that money, or we're going to lock down Boston, and we're not going to let you trade, and we're not going to let you export stuff, and we're going to send soldiers there and make you behave. And that was a turning point. That's why Boston Tea Party, and Boston itself becomes this focal point for the revolution, because they're the ones resisting first, and they're the ones resisting most strongly against the British, what they call British tyranny. Now, during this whole thing, they've already got this slogan going, don't get me wrong, from 1763 until the outbreak of the war in 1776. So for about 15 years almost, everybody's using this slogan. It's like, okay, if you want to tax us, fine, but we have to have members of parliament, or we have to have our own governors that negotiate with the British Empire, or that they are members of the government in England, which they did not. The people who were in charge of things in America were chosen in England, and they were sent to America. But the Americans wanted their own people to be elected and chosen, and therefore more connected to what the people actually wanted. They wanted those people to be in the government or to have influence in the government, which those people, they were denied. And therefore Benjamin Franklin was one of those people who went to England to try to negotiate, and Benjamin Franklin just ended up getting shouted at and insulted for an hour like he was some sort of, misbehaving child. And Benjamin Franklin is pretty much the most respected American in the colonies at that time, and still a legend. He was a legend in his own time. So when the British Parliament insulted and disrespected him, and he went back to America, they pretty much destroyed their chances of having any, reasonable compromise without having some sort of violent, military conflict. Benjamin Franklin was actually pro negotiation, and he had thought that they could work out some sort of thing to it be a component of the British Empire. But after he saw how crazy and irrational they were, he realized it was done, that there was no choice but to become independent and to rule themselves. So he returned to America of a different mindset, that there was no chance to reconcile America, the colonies, with the British Empire. And that changed the game entirely, because Benjamin Franklin was actually on the British people's side. They made a huge mistake. But since the British Empire believed that they should be in control without any sort of feedback or power sharing agreement, I guess we can't be surprised that they did that. Now, that brings us to the founding fathers. And there's three founding fathers that I usually just talk about. There are more than that, but I just want to talk about the three of them, and they're in the textbook, so I'm just going to briefly describe each one, and you need to read the textbook to get a little bit more information, because I did write about them in detail. So we got Benjamin Franklin, first of all, I just mentioned, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson isn't in the textbook, but Benjamin Franklin and George Washington are. So first of all, Benjamin Franklin, I love the guy. What can I say? He's good at everything. He's a polymath. He's multilingual. He was interesting because he was a politician, and he was a businessman. He was a scientist. He was a writer. He was good at everything. I certainly aspire to be somebody even close to as intelligent as him. He flew the kite up in the air. He discovered electricity. He wrote very, very well-written pieces of writing. He went to France as the official representative of America to persuade the French to support the English, to fight the English and support America. And he accomplished that. And he mostly accomplished that by speaking French, dressing up like an American frontiersman with a, buckskin clothing and a coonskin hat, but being able to communicate in French and being such an intelligent, educated person, you can imagine all the French people just being in love with the guy. He's just the cutest, smartest, coolest thing they've ever seen. Fashionable and just an interesting phenomenon, and they just ate up his show. It was all for show, I think. So he succeeded in that. Without Benjamin Franklin, who knows if the French really would have... They were in huge financial trouble, but they really wanted to get revenge on the British, so they jumped in on the American side, and without them, the Americans likely would have lost. So you can say that Benjamin Franklin was... without Benjamin Franklin, there's no revolution. Without Benjamin Franklin, there's no George Washington. Without George Washington, there's no Benjamin Franklin, because George Washington was the military leader. He was really tall. He's good looking. You probably read about him in school, and you probably think that he's the most perfect person ever, and he never said anything wrong. He never said bad words, and his decisions were perfect. But the truth is that he was a very talented and impressive leader, but he did have his faults. One of his faults was his pride. He didn't accept criticism, and he had really strict decor. Like if you were working for him, you had to knock, in a certain way and walk in and bow and address him with his title. And everything was super formal, and if you didn't follow the decorum, he would be offended, and he was very moody. He never swore, but he was a proud individual who stood on you would never be able to relax, essentially. You would never be able to relax around George Washington because he's so uptight. His collar's just as tight as it possibly can be, and as straight as it possibly can be. And if you weren't like that, then you probably wouldn't. I mean, lots of his assistants basically wrote how horrible it was to work for him. So he wasn't a great boss, but he was a great commander, and he recognized what people needed to fight well, and he recognized what needed to be done always, and people would follow him to the grave. They would follow him to hell and back. He's one of those commanders where the charisma of his presence and his forcefulness and his connection to his officers and his soldiers was solid, and they could fight and do things that in regular armies, in regular other commanders would never be able to hold an army together. They would all go home because they're too hungry, or they're scared, or they've been out too long, or they hadn't seen their families, or they had no money. But George Washington's army would fight until he told them to stop, essentially. And that's really, I think, what allowed him to succeed, is that he wasn't the most brilliant strategist, or strategist. It's the wrong pronunciation. Strategist. He wasn't the most brilliant strategist, or tactically he wasn't the best either. There's other people around in this period that are much better than him. But he had the morale and the respect that he commanded from his troops was unbelievable. Almost unique, you would say. George Washington became almost like a god or a mythical figure by the time he was old. If you just did what George Washington told you, no matter what he asked, it's George Washington, so you do it. And that's the reason why he's probably considered, along with Abraham Lincoln and a few other people, he's considered the greatest American who ever lived. But remember, he wasn't American. He was born British. He only became an American in 1776 or arguably 1783. But we'll talk about that in the next part.